Hey everyone! Today on the plastic canvas we're painting some of the miniatures from Tang Garden by Thundergriff Games. Hey everyone, Matt here from the Plastic Canvas and welcome to the second episode in this Tang Garden series. Today we are painting 5 of the characters that you can play as in this garden construction game by Thundergriff Games. Now here we have some of the paints that are in my collection, and these ones would be my lesser used paints. They're quite bright, vibrant colours like the bright magenta and the turquoises and the really sort of bold oranges and that. And these are colours that don't get used very often because most miniatures don't have these colours as part of them. Most of the colour palettes of minis, especially in board games, are browns and greys, maybe a typical blue or a typical red, but not those more bright, vibrant colours. And these ones are important because if you saw my unboxing video of Tang Garden, the one thing that I was disappointed with in terms of the production quality were the miniatures. From the pictures in the Kickstarter campaign, I imagine that these would be more detailed and a more solid scale, I suppose, but these are quite small. They are very slender, I guess would be the word, not a lot of detail. And because of the scale, there isn't a lot of surface area to work with to do really cool blending for highlighting and shading and building textures and those sorts of things. So while I was looking at the miniatures and trying to think of how I was going to make these look interesting out on the table despite their, scale and simplicity, I was then sort of looking at the artwork, and I absolutely love the artwork that's right through this game. It is very, very well done, and one thing that is consistent is the intensity and I suppose the saturation of the colours. And so that's how I thought I'd be able to try and bring these miniatures to life, I suppose, is through the colours that I use, and really trying to make them really eye-catching through the intensity of the paints that I choose to use. And so those paints that you saw a little bit earlier, that part of my collection, those are the ones that I'm going to be focusing on as much as possible, because they are those really saturated, bright, vibrant paints that don't get used too often, that will hopefully bring these to life and out on the table, despite their simplicity, still make them look really, really cool. So that's going to be the focus of this episode, is just the way that colours can be used to bring simple minis to life. And the 5 characters that I'm painting in this video, I chose them because I think they're the ones that will lend themselves to that the best, probably the ones that kind of had those most vibrant colours. And in the intro, I've got photos there of the 5 that I'm doing. I actually ended up changing one of them, the 5th one that I ended up doing, because the student was the 5th one. And by the time I got to the student, I'd already done a few that were wearing robes, and one of them, the merchant it might be, I'm not sure. Anyway, he's wearing quite a bit of green, and so the student was another one that was wearing robes and another one that had green, so I wanted to mix that up a little bit. And I went with the wayfarer because he has a backpack on with this kind of wooden frame sort of thing and a few different colours. So yeah, I made a little bit of a swap there as I got to painting that 5th one. So I chose characters that I thought would lend themselves the best to showing off the way that colours can be used to bring these guys to life. So the first thing that I did with each of these miniatures when starting to paint them was decide on a focal point. So what aspect of the mini was going to get most of my time and most of my attention to make it look interesting and eye-catching on the table. Because these minis are very, very simple, it's only worth spending so much time on them, and I didn't want to, overdo it with each of them. So there needed to be some aspect that I knew that was going to be my priority, and the aspect that was going to lend itself most to making them look interesting out on the table. And so for the sword dancer here, it was the blue of her shirt sort of thing that she's wearing there. A lot of the other ones that I do in this video do have quite a few different colours going on with them, but the sword dancer here, she's only got a couple. It's her shirt, pants, shoes, you know, the sword and that, so quite a minimal colour palette, I suppose, and so it was pretty easy to work out that that blue is what the focus was going to be. So what I really tried to do there was spend some time with my highlighting to build some contrast there and work up to quite a bright blue that's what's in her artwork, because that was the thing that really sort of drew my attention to her in her artwork, was the contrast in the blue of her shirt. So I'm just starting the highlighting there, but initially I laid down that dark turquoise color so that any of that dark turquoise that I left showing was going to be the shadow. So I started with a dark color so that I didn't actually need to build any shadows. Now you can see that I've just gone to a lighter version of that color. This is Blue Green by Vallejo. It was one that still had a similar appearance to it, I suppose, a similar mix of the blue and green, but just brighter. And now I'm just going around and just starting to pick out, first of all, like just where the light would be hitting, so the tops of her shoulders, but then also some of the folds that are in the sculpt. The detailing, as I've said, is very minimal, so there isn't a lot of folds and creases and things like that, but wherever they were, I tried to pick them out. And you can see I'm trying to keep the blends as smooth as possible. Like I also said earlier, with the size of the surface areas that you have, it is tricky to get smooth blends because you don't have a lot of distance to work with. But I'm just laying this color down where the light would be hitting, and then just feathering it out from there, just to try and get a blend from it down to the deeper sort of turquoise. And this is my typical highlighting approach. When I first started painting, it was very much just lay a base coat down, and then just lighten that color and then just use that as the highlight, but that always left quite defined lines between the highlights and the base coats, whereas now I really try and blend a lot more just to get those smooth transitions. And you can see, yeah, as I've written there, I wasn't happy with how the highlighting looked on that little section of her shirt, so I just repainted it and I've started again. I think what I didn't like about that part was, as I was saying just before, there was really clearly defined line between the highlight that I put down with this blue-green and the shadows of the turquoise color that I put down. So what I just focused on here was just putting less paint down and then just blending that little bit out and then just adding more as I needed to, rather than just plonking a blob of paint down and then trying to blend that out. And that worked a lot better, was just putting less down and just going a little bit slower. And now you can see I've added some lighter blue to it, and this is now just starting to build the contrast. So now I'm just really focusing this on where the light would be hitting and then feathering it out even less than what I did when I just put that blue-green down. And so now we've introduced a third color, and this is just helping to blend the colors together, get a nice smooth transition, but it's also helping to build the contrast. And by slowly building up to the colors, it allows you to go from a deeper color from the shadows to a brighter color with the highlights, because you don't have those defined lines. It does do it a little more subtly, I suppose. And yeah, so this is just the approach that I'm going for with the sword dancer here, is just slowly building up to lighter and lighter blues, just where the light would be hitting to build that contrast, so that contrast between the shadows and the highlights can be seen from around the edge of the table. That's one thing I am always very mindful of, is that I am painting these to be in the middle of the table and to be looked at from that distance. People that are looking at these aren't going to be holding them just in front of their face like I do. And so the contrasts need to be seen from that distance. And so hopefully, and I think it has that has come out, that difference between that dark turquoise that I put down first and then the LED blue that I'm using there as the finishing highlight. That just creates a good contrast that really helps to bring the form out, I suppose, that's in the sculpt, and yeah, just to make it a little more eye-catching, because that bright blue is what's drawing your attention in this sculpt. And so now I'm just starting the base with this. What I do with each of them is just that middle section of the base that they're standing on, I just put that as black, and then just a ring around the edge that matches the main color that's used. Also on the player cards, I have a ring behind them, and I tried to match that color as well, just to make it easily identifiable which card goes with which miniature. The other reason though that I use black for the middle there is that black always helps to make the colors that are around it pop and just become, or just to stand out more. And so that's part of why I've chosen to use black in the base, because it helps the colors of the actual miniature to stand out. So yeah, so there we go. So there's our sword dancer done. So the focal point there was the blue of her shirt. That's where I spent most of my time. And yeah, it really sort of helped to draw the attention to that and make those colors quite vibrant. Alright, so now we're on to our second character, which is the lady, and working out what her focal point was going to be was very, very easy. It is obviously going to be her parasol umbrella thing that she's holding onto there. I do end up painting it with my clear magenta, which is one of my newer paints that I haven't really had a chance to use yet, because not many things are such a bright, vibrant color as that is. So I was really happy to see that I was going to be able to use it for something. And that umbrella that she's holding is the main thing to talk about with painting the lady. So I'm going to come back when I get up to her, because there's not really anything else to mention at the moment. I'm just laying down other base colors. So I'll just leave you for a minute or two just while I paint the other parts, and then as I get to the umbrella, I'll come back and talk about what I'm doing there. Alright, so now I'm getting a start on her umbrella, and you can see how awesome that magenta color is. As soon as I saw her player card and the color of her umbrella, I knew this was the paint that I was going to be using. So the original approach that I was going to be using for her parasol there was to lay down that base coat as I did, and then to use my purple wash over the top that would flow into those grooves that are in there. I think you can see them just there, that sort of divide the umbrella into its different triangular sections, and here it is here. But as you'll see, as I start to put it on, it looks absolutely awful. The problem here was that there were just too many flat surfaces, and so while it did, I suppose, go into each of those grooves, it also just sat in really inconsistent thicknesses across the rest of it, and it just looked awful. So then I repainted it, and I thought, hey, I can use my sort of more reddish Citadel wash there, and nope, it looked just as bad. And you can see I was really, really thrilled about it. So then I thought about, okay, so how am I going to go about this without using any washes? And what I thought I would do is to wet blend in the shadow in the bottom section of the umbrella to make it look darker, and then to put a lighter tone in the top section just to make it look as though the light's hitting the top of the umbrella and not so much the bottom section, and to then freehand those the grooves. So I use my darker purple to paint in those grooves, and then I go back to my lighter pinky sort of color that I end up mixing together to then pick out the edges of each of those triangular sections just to try and make them stand out a little bit. And that's what I end up going with, and I'm really, really happy with how that ended up looking. So I laid down an initial blend, and now I'm just building up to lighter and lighter or darker and darker colors depending on the section that I'm working on, and just blending them together. So what I'm doing here is laying down, say with this part here, for example, laying down the shadow and then going back to the magenta color and just putting that right in that, if you imagine that the umbrella is like a clock, laying the magenta back down it 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock, and then just blending it either up or down depending on whether I'm doing the highlight or the shadow, and then just slowly working them together. And what I ended up finding was that I didn't push the shadow or the highlight far enough towards the 9 and 3 o'clock, and so I just went back a few times, and you can see I'm still doing it here to go brighter and brighter, but to push it further and further away from 12 and 6 o'clock, just to really kind of bring that highlight out and to make it really, really obvious that we do have this brighter section at the top and the darker section down the bottom. And I think that might be the finishing point there, because I was really happy with how that looked. So now I'm using my dark purple there to carefully, and this did take a little while to do, to carefully paint in each of those grooves that divides it into each of those triangular sections. And then once this is done, which will be in just a couple of seconds, I then start to mix in a highlight color, which you can see there is the magenta mixed with some pink, and I just pick out the edges of each of these triangular sections. And as I work around, I try and pick out, when coming down the face of the umbrella like I am here, the upper edge. So with the triangles, if you imagine it as having 3 edges, so the first edge is the actual outside edge of the umbrella, then there's the 2 edges of each triangle section that come to that middle point. Of those 2 sections that come to the middle point, I'm just picking out the upper edge and leaving the lower edge unpainted, just to try and give the illusion that just that upper edge is what's catching the light. And I was really, really happy with how this looked in the end, because you've got that shift in tone from the highlight at the top, so the upper section of the umbrella, and as we spin around to the back, that'll be seen, yep, just there, down to the darker section underneath. Then you can see each of those individual sections of the umbrella from that edge highlighting, and I think that just makes it quite eye-catching, so I was really, really happy with how that ended up. I also did some very, very minimal highlighting on the purple of her robes, but just enough to bring out some of the folds. But yeah, definitely the main focal point there was the umbrella, and that's what I want attention to be drawn to when it's on the table. Alright, so now we're on to the merchant, our third character, and approaching this guy was a little bit different to the sword dancer and the lady, because the sword dancer and the lady had very clear elements that were going to be the focal point. So for the sword dancer, it was the blue of her shirt, for the lady, it was her umbrella, whereas this guy didn't have one particular element that seemed like it was standing out. But what he does have, though, in terms of his colours, is that really cool goldish yellow on his upper section, and then a really nice green in the highlights of his robe. And so that's what I decided was going to be the focus of the merchant, was the highlighting and the shading that goes into the yellow and the green, and really just trying to bring out all of the different folds and things that are in his robe, because that does seem to be something that has come out a bit more in the artwork as opposed to the previous 2. And so, yeah, I suppose that yellow there in the artwork, it is like it's yellow, but it definitely has a goldish kind of look to it. So what I did there was I mixed yellow and gold together. So first of all, it was to deepen the yellow a little bit, so that as I highlight, I have like clear room to move up to, going brighter. But also it did give it that gold tinge that's in the artwork that I really, really liked. And then, so yeah, with the green here, just laying down a wash there just to darken it off, so that I don't really have to do any actual shading there. And I'm also just laying down the sepia wash here on each of the yellow sections, just to start to bring out the different folds that are there, so that I can, in my highlighting, just avoid them and leave those as the shadows. Just quickly at this point here, you'll see that I mix some Lamia medium in with the black wash. That's just to thin it down so that when it goes over these white sections, it still leaves them looking white, but it does give a bit of a grey tinge to them, because I do come back later on and highlight that scarf thing that he's wearing, because I still wanted there to be a clear transition from the bright white on the top of his shoulders down to not grey, but just less white down the bottom, and so that's why I thinned that out, so that it just gave it that off-white grey sort of tinge. Alright, so now we're into the highlighting and the shading of these yellow sections on the upper part of his robe, and I just went back, as you can see, to the original base coating colour, so the yellow and the gold mixed together there, and I'm just going around and just picking out all of the raised sections, so the parts that wouldn't be in shadow, and then just to build up the intensity of the highlight, because there is, in the artwork, it is really, really bright. The yellow almost goes to white, and so I just went back to just straight yellow, just to build that contrast up a little bit more, and just so that there was that nice transition. So yeah, it was just that yellow and gold mixed together, then the sepia wash over the top, and then back to the yellow gold mixture to do the first stage of the highlighting, which was just picking out all the parts that wouldn't be in shadow, and then just finished off with just the straight yellow, just to build that intensity a little bit. And yeah, so now you can see I'm just doing the white sections of his scarf, and I just, with the straight white, I just put that paint down where the light would be hitting the most, so the top of his shoulders, the top of his wrists, that part at the end of his sleeves, and then just carefully smoothed that out, feathered it out, to meet the wash that I put down that had gone a little bit grey, and that just helped to build a little bit of contrast and a bit of form there. So now I'm highlighting the green part of his robe, and this, I suppose, would be one of the focal points that I'm working on here. So I do work through a few different tones. I just went back to the brilliant green, which was the green that I used as the initial base coat. It picked out all of the folds that would be getting some amount of light, just to start to build that contrast up. And then I started to mix in viper green just to make it a bit brighter. And then I went to straight viper green, and now you can see I'm starting to mix some yellow into the viper green just to really build that contrast up. And every time I've lightened the color off, I've been picking out less and less areas to highlight, and each time, I'm feathering it out to smoothen it out, you get a nice smooth transition to the previous highlight that I've done. But again, as it gets brighter and brighter, I'm feathering it out less and less. And despite the simplicity of this model, I still did work through quite a few different tones in the highlighting, and I guess really I over-highlighted it because I wanted this to be one of the focal points, something that's going to draw people's attention, all of the folds and that are in his robe. And like I said earlier, I paint these minis to be in the middle of the table, and that's where people are going to be looking at them. And so that contrast needs to be seen by people that are sitting around the edge. So the depth of color there is really what I was going for. So the difference between the darkest green of the shadows through to the brightest green with that yellow mixed in, that just really helps to bring all of the folds out, and just gives it a lot of form, and that can be seen while he's in the middle of the table. And so there he is finished. So I did picked out a couple of little extra elements there, just the gold around the edge of his sleeve and a couple little parts like that, just to help break some of that green up a little bit, which I think was a good thing to do. But yeah, it really just sort of tied everything together there in the end. And now we're on to the Empress, which is our fourth character. And out of the 5 that I do here, this is probably the one that I am least happy with. I initially picked the Empress because of the part of her outfit that goes up around her head. I'm not really sure what it is, kind of her collar, I suppose. It's gigantic though. But in her artwork, it's this really cool sort of gold color, and I thought that would be the part that I could really pick out. That would be the focal point, and it is. And she has around her back there this kind of not a scarf sort of thing, but just this part that kind of drapes around her back and goes over her arms. That ends up being gold as well. In the end though, it just doesn't have the impact that I wanted it to. I'm not really sure why, whether I needed to use different colours or maybe build more contrast in it, I'm not really sure. But anyway, so I might just talk about that when we come back to that part being done or being close to being finished. So I'll just leave you just to watch. You can see there I'm starting to lay the gold down, so it is just straight gold that I use. And yeah, so I'll come back sort of when that section is more done to talk about why I think it didn't really work too well. Alright, so we're back to the gold now. Now, you mightn't be able to tell from on the camera, but, you know, I laid down that black wash over all of the gold sections because there is a little bit of detailing in it on this part that drapes over her back. There are some folds in it. It is a little bit layered, and then that bit that goes up around her head, her collar, whatever, it would actually be gold. It does have some detailing in it. So I put down the black wash just to flow into those parts to help bring it out, and now I'm just going back with the gold and just picking out all of the more flat surfaces to bring the shine and the brightness back, but to leave the detailing in there. And I did use a little bit of black just to help bring those recesses out a little bit more. So yeah, just didn't end up with the impact or having the impact that I wanted it to. And I think probably part of that is because maybe the rest of the robe just takes away from it a little bit. I did spend a bit of time highlighting the robes to bring out the different folds, so that probably ends up becoming more of the focal point in the end, I suppose. And maybe, I don't know, there just isn't enough gold for the shininess of it to really stand out. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm still happy enough with it in the end, but yeah, it's probably the one where it didn't, what I intended to be the focal point didn't have the impact that I wanted it to. But, you know, in the end, still, you know, all right. Alright, so now we're on to the Wayfarer, which is the 5th character in this video, and like I mentioned earlier, this guy was not one of the original 5 that I chose to do in this video. I ended up bringing him in, swapping him out for the student, because the student was just another character wearing a robe and had similar sorts of greens to him as the merchant did, so I didn't think there'd be much different there to talk about. I ended up bringing this guy in because there are some really interesting colours in his colour palette, but also he's wearing that backpack thing with the wooden frame, and I thought that was just a different element. So this is just a bit of a different guy to paint to the other ones. And so I suppose that backpack there is part of the focal point, but also around his waist, the part that's white at the moment, it's this kind of, I don't know, beltish kind of thing that he's wearing. It's got this really cool yellowy orange sort of color, so I'm just starting to paint that now. But then there's this really bright red sort of striping, a bit diagonal from top to bottom. And I just thought that was something that could really stand out and look really cool. So yeah, between the backpack, which I'm starting there, and that bit of material that goes around his stomach, those were those 2 elements that I wanted to bring out and that I thought were a bit different to the other ones. So there's nothing really too special about how I paint this guy. There's not really a lot of highlighting and shading that I do, because I do want just the attention to be on his backpack and that bit of material. So I just worked on just building just a bit of an interesting green there for his robes, because I didn't want it to be a similar green to the merchant and what will end up going on the student. They're the green characters, so I wanted him to be a little bit different, and then I added in that sort of pinstriping, I suppose, around the edge of his robes, just on the trims, just to help add an extra little element there. But yeah, outside of that, it's really just blocking in colours. And then on his backpack, I do put a brown wash down just to flow into the recesses, and then going back with that same brown that I used to base coat the backpack with, I just picked out the edges. There are some interesting sort of folds in the backpack, in the sculpt, so I just kind of followed them, just used them as a guideline. And then yeah, with that material around his stomach, I just laid down that bright yellow that I've got, and then using the same red that I am here, the Bloody Red, I think it's called. Yeah, Bloody Red from Vallejo. It's a really quite saturated red. I just use that to do the striping there, just to really make them stand out. And that's sort of all I really did with the Wayfarer. Nothing too complicated there. Mainly just about just blocking in those colours, but using those really, really bright colours around the material, and then just doing a bit of highlighting on his backpack there. Alright, so just as this guy starts to come to an end, the video is nearly done, I'm going to start talking about my overall thoughts on how these characters ended up looking. And I've got to say, I'm really, really happy with where they ended up, considering how simple these minis are. Like I said, with the Empress, she's probably the one that I was least happy with in the end. The gold elements there that were the focal point for her just didn't have the impact that I wanted it to, but still happy enough with her. But overall, really, really happy with how all of these came up. Thinking back to my first impressions of these minis when we opened up the box, I was disappointed with how they looked. The images in the Kickstarter campaign when we were originally thinking about backing this game, they looked really, really good. There was lots of detail. It looked like the scale was going to be really good, but it just didn't end up being that way when we opened up the box. And so considering from, you know, what my first impression was of them to how happy I am with how these came up, yeah, really, really good. And just like some very, very simple approaches. I haven't done anything too complicated here, and I haven't tried to paint them to a high standard because they're not high quality minis, so it's just not worth spending that much time. But through some very, very simple approaches and having a focal point for each of them where I spent most of my time, that is going to be what's used to draw people's attention. I think it has worked really well, especially considering how simple these minis are. But like I said a couple of times through the video, I was painting them with you know, the intention that these are going to be looked at in the middle of the table and not up close. But I think, you know, one really, really simple thing that did work well was having that black in the middle of the base there, helped all the colors to pop, and was quite a simple thing that worked out well. So thank you very, very much for spending some time watching me paint some more minis. I hope you've gotten something out of this video. Please do give it a like if you enjoyed it, and hit the subscribe button if you want to see more videos. I will be painting the roofs of the pagodas as well, so stick around if you want to see them. But this is Matt from the Plastic Canvas signing out. Happy painting, everyone. Cheers.